Hello, Mo. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll give our listeners a little bit of a background about yourself. So Dr. Mo Assoum is a infectious disease epidemiologist. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into this field, what you're currently doing in that field, or if you're working in that role, and what it looks like for you at the moment?
Thank you very much for having me. How I got into the field is a bit of a long story, but I'll try and make it as short as possible. So when I was in my undergrad, I was going down the medical path and really into it. And then my brother passed away in 2008, and then it made being in medicine and being down the medical path really challenging. So I ended up changing pathways because it was very confronting. So I ended up just jumping into a general science degree to maintain momentum. And then while I was doing the science degree, it was anyone who's gone through a trauma, right, will find it difficult reacclimatizing. And doing a science degree, majoring in physiology, anatomy, histology, which are the same medical things that I was doing previously, was a bit more confronting. So I ended up then having a chat with my supervisor, well, with the sub deans at the university. And he was like, he looked at me, he kind of knew what I was going to be interested in, because he knew that I was changing majors around a lot, changing subjects a fair bit. And he told me, do you know what? Because I was going to ask for a waiver to do a third year unit. And he told me, if you do this one unit and you do very well in it, you get a distinction or high distinction in it, I will waive any prerequisite for any subjects you want to do for your third year. I said, okay, sure. Game on. And
Oh,
anyone who knows me knows I'm a bit competitive. And it was a medical geography unit, which was it's a kind of like a branch of epidemiology as such. And I tried it, I fell in love with it. And then after I finished my degree, I jumped into a master's of international public health. I did my honors in that, and then I did a graduate diploma in geographical information systems because I had something in my mind of how to put all these together. And then I ended up doing a PhD in infectious disease epidemiology.
that's cool.
And yeah, then now 15 years later, or is it 15 years? God, it feels like 15 years later, here I am.
Wow, so it's quite a long journey that you actually went through at uni as well.
But a realistic,
Yeah,
a lot of like it's relatable to a lot of people because a lot of people start off on a certain path and then end up veering off. And I guess it's God's way of showing you where you really need to be.
exactly. Absolutely. And that's the thing, you never know where you're going to end up. And for me, the journey that I took, there was always a lot of goodness in it too, despite the challenges, despite everything that we had gone through, and I had gone through the journey. You end up in a much better place, in a much stronger, more empathetic place, because when you're working in public health and you're working in international public health, you need to know how to speak to people. You need to know how to be resilient, especially when a pandemic happens. And you need to know how to really speak to people at their level in the field, at an emotional level, not only just at an intellectual level or whatever, but you need to be able to connect with them at an emotional level to be able to really understand what they're going through so that you're able to help them the best you possibly can.
Mm-hmm. There is always a better way you can put things that will make people more receptive to the information that you're giving them and not panic as much.
And
Absolutely.
I think dealing with
Absolutely.
that many people as well just means you get that opportunity to develop all those interpersonal skills and communication
Yeah.
skills, and meet people from different backgrounds and culturally and linguistically diverse communities. And
Yeah.
especially in this space, sort of when we're looking at infectious disease and things like that, we know that being able to communicate to different communities is so important in order for them to get the help they need. So
Yeah.
with all that said, Mo, tell us a little bit about what you're doing now. So are you working
Okay.
in the field?
Yeah.
What does a typical day look like for you?
Okay, so at the moment, I'm a research fellow. I've actually just got a new research fellowship at the University of New South Wales, and I'm working on developing new and interesting monitoring and evaluation systems for massive program implementation and interventions. So, say, for example, we want to treat X number of people for a certain disease. How do we know that these people were treated and that we reached everyone we needed to and that they were treated at the appropriate time, right? And that the program was having the intended impact that it was meant to have. So that's one, and I'm also lecturing at the university as well in epidemiology and in public health. So I try to keep myself busy as much as possible.
And you recently married, yeah? How long's it been?
Yes, it has been 3 months.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so newlywed and yeah. So, but in order to where I got to now, after finishing my PhD, actually during my PhD, I worked for the WHO at the same time, right? So basically, just to give you a holistic view, I gave you the academic, but I didn't give you the career thing, because I think they both tie in together. So during the PhD, and even during my undergrad, I was still working in my field, in my master's. So during the PhD, I took a bit of a break to go work with the WHO for around a year in Geneva. And then I came back and then continued working on my PhD. Then post-PhD, I worked over in London. I moved over to London and worked as a infectious disease portfolio manager for a philanthropy, basically deciding and implementing really, really large programs, trying to treat as many people across 22 countries. And then after that, COVID hit, and then I was working with a few different organizations in different capacities and working on COVID at the same time.
Wow, that's huge. Was that overwhelming for you, that whole experience?
COVID or everything else?
COVID specifically.
Well, look, everyone thinks that because we're an epidemiologist, make it easy, no one knew what I was, so no one knew what I did for work before COVID. So no one knew what epidemiology was before COVID. Yeah. And then when COVID came along, people started understanding and started having an appreciation. But even then, even though it's a once in a lifetime or once in a generation or once in 100 years pandemic, they are incredibly stressful. And although we have probably experienced more than probably the last 30 years or 40 years worth of epidemiologists have experienced because of this pandemic, it doesn't detract away from the impact it has on your health and the impact it has on your life as well. It's been a fantastic experience, but one I probably don't want to have again.
Yeah. To be fair, Mo, I actually found your page during COVID, and it was from someone else's share, and that was the first time I ever came across an epidemiologist in general on Instagram. And then, it's not every day you see an epidemiologist, that is from the same background, like, he's Arab. So yeah, so I was like, who is this guy? I need to follow. And just, like, you were putting out some really good content during that time and doing a lot of the work in terms of educating around a lot of the questions that people had, and so many concerns that were sort of floating around during that time. So that's actually how I discovered your page, and I think Miriam's ended up following suit not long after. But we have been fans for a bit of time. So
Thank you very much.
Myth-busting.
I've taken a bit of a break, though. It's been probably around 6 to 8 months of a break at the moment, but hopefully, inshallah, I'll get back into it soon.
Yeah, it's a lot of tricky. It was very tricky. Dealing with. People took it very personal. Yeah, a lot of friendships were broken. Yeah, family ties even. So
yeah, it's amazing how misinformation can actually impact so many people across so many different facets of life. The amount of people I had who I didn't realize were good friends or friends until they became supporters, and then the amount of people who I thought were good friends ended up not being really good friends during COVID was absolutely stunning.
So how did you manage, I guess, some of the controversy around vaccines? Like, what was your response to people? How did you navigate that sort of new area, people getting more exposed to so much information at that time?
Yeah.
Thought that they knew it. They knew everything because they did a little bit of Google research, vaccines, this, vaccines, that. How did you respond to that? I guess, capacity.
It was a learning curve, as it was for me. It was a learning curve for me as much as it was for everyone. For me, I was having those conversations on a daily basis at home and with the phone calls. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, I was receiving around 100 messages a day from different people just asking, what's going on? What's this? What's that? What's this? What's that? And it was getting exhausting just answering the same questions again and again with different people. So that's why I decided to just start posting things on social media and addressing the key concepts, the key things that were coming up across the board, across all the messages I was getting, and addressing them. And when the vaccines came into the mix, and I already foresaw misinformation was going to be an issue, because before the vaccines were available in Australia, they were partly available in the US and other parts of the world. And the amount of misinformation that was there already was staggering, right? And I was already having those conversations here. And then things started getting really bad here in terms of COVID numbers, but then also the misinformation. And what made the misinformation worse for us in our community is that they were translated into Arabic, right? A lot of the misinformation was translated into Arabic, into Turkish, into the local language, into our native languages. And it made it harder to address, because the other side was not translating things into appropriate language or speaking to people like people, right? One thing that always annoyed me when I saw the daily briefings on the news of COVID updates and so on is that the doctors and the ministers were speaking down to people in a way, not necessarily speaking to people as people, and not really explaining things in terms that people will understand. Misinformation addresses people at their level, at a very general level. It's why it's so effective. It takes an iota of truth, which could be the sky is blue, right? And then wraps it in all this other stuff, right? And then pushes it out in a way that is emotional, that is concerning and alarming. And then on top of that, you have, it pushes it out in a way that's alarming. And then people, in a way that people can understand, right? Whilst on the other side, the real information, the true scientific information is made inaccessible because it's written in academic English, right? And spoken by experts and professionals who don't really distill it down to a general population. And then when the general population try to understand it, they take bits and pieces of what they want, which would then reinforces misinformation rather than the positive and the real information. So when dealing with the whole vaccine controversy and so on, what I decided to do was I decided to take the actual scientific information, distill it down for the general audience, and just purely fact check misinformation using that and showing the sources really clearly, right? And empowering the general population from our own community with our own languages as well as English, right, to lead their lives with the knowledge that we've given them, right, to be able to counter this misinformation themselves. So that was the approach we took and that I took as well. And it was tough, not to say the least. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question as your answer, but I'm just going off on tangents because I know that it's quite a big question.
We can cut bits out and chop it all up at the end. That's fine.
Yeah.
I think it's all relevant anyway.
Yeah, I think it's all relevant, 100%. So there is a growing concern that vaccine hesitancy is contributing to the spread of preventable diseases. This is a hot topic at the moment with a lot of different outbreaks of different viruses in Melbourne at the moment. So I think RSV and influenza, there's lots of outbreaks right now. So what measures can be taken to combat vaccine hesitancy and encourage people to get vaccinated?
So first thing we need to do is understand what people's real fear is, right? They use all this different information and misinformation to justify why they don't want to get vaccinated, but they don't really get to the core of what they're scared of, what they're afraid of, what they're hesitant about. But when you dive down and actually tear apart their argument, you're left with the core of what it is they're afraid of. Yeah. In some cases, they're afraid that the child may be autistic. In some cases, they're afraid that it may cause a miscarriage. In some cases, they're afraid that it may cause other disabilities and so on. And the fact is that all these fears come down to a common thread, which is a study by one person who came out a few years later admitting that he falsified all his data and proving that vaccines were harmful in this case. The reality is that the vaccinations for the vast majority of people are extremely safe, right? There are some people who are going to be allergic, right? There are some people who may react or may have adverse reactions. But for the vast majority of people, vaccines are incredibly safe and incredibly important, right? And when we look at, say, for example, vaccine hesitancy and measles or and other things, measles have made a comeback, right, in recent years because of hesitancy, right? When we look at measles, I know one of your questions that you're going to ask later on is about measles and polio, but I could actually just speak about measles now as well, because measles before the vaccine came out was incredibly prevalent. It was around if we're looking at in the US alone, in around the 1940s and even the 1960s, just before the vaccine came out, we were looking at 410 cases per 100,000 people of measles, right? That's by any measure, that's a very high number because it means it's prevalent and it's a highly infectious disease. Post-vaccine, and as soon as the vaccine became available, that number dropped from around 410,000 down to around 20 cases per 100,000 within 5 years.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah.
So that just goes to show how effective this vaccine was, right? Measles is incredibly dangerous because if it doesn't kill the person, there are post-measles side effects as well. So there is a form of encephalitis, which happens in a child 7 years following measles, which can ultimately lead to their death as well, even if they've recovered from measles itself. And then there's also the case that measles can also cause a lot of other morbidities and a lot of other disabilities as well. So it's an incredibly dangerous illness. And the fact that one of the reasons why people were afraid of vaccinating their child against measles is autism, which is completely false, right? Which is completely defunct, also highlights a really important fact, right? Or a really important piece of information. People who are afraid of their child developing autism and not vaccinating their child because of autism are in fact saying that or indicating that they prefer their child die from measles than be disabled. Mm. And it's an incredibly confronting thing when you think about it, because I know a lot of autistic kids. I've got autistic kids in my family, right? And they're beautiful children, right? And they some grow into amazing adults and some grow into beautiful people as well, right? But when you take this argument that we don't want to vaccinate because it causes autism, which it does not, right? Yeah. In essence, you're saying that we prefer our child die or other children die because our child's infectious than them developing a disability.
It's also pathologizing autism and neurodivergence as though like it's something so bad to have.
Exactly.
I think when you look at it that way, it's actually really harmful.
But, you know, I guess in parents' defense, they feel it's the first time that instead of taking a cure, you're taking a disease. So it's kind of like, why would I do that to myself if there's a risk that I could actually get sick or get a side effects? It's kind of goes back to that optimistic bias that maybe I won't even get the disease. So why am I going to give myself the disease and have possible side effects? So
but you're not giving yourself the disease. That's the problem.
Yes.
You're taking proteins from a disease that's been completely deactivated, and then you're introducing it into your system, so your body develops an immune response. And the really interesting fact is the Muslim world is the one that created this in the first place. Yeah. We, in fact, developed this form of treatment, right? We developed it I believe it was during the plague times. So
if I'm thinking correct, I think it was actually with the venom of a scorpion. I don't know if I'm making that up, but I think it actually started like in the desert in terms of like they didn't want to die from certain insects and creatures, so they would like inject them, like they would just kind of put a little bit of the venom into their skin to create that immune response, which is so.
It was actually more related to, I think it was either smallpox or the actual plague itself. So actually in the Muslim world, they'll take, and it was under the Ottomans, they took a piece of or bits of the smallpox, I believe it was the plague, I can't remember which one, and then they created a vaccine from it and would microdose a person to create an immune response so the person would not get sick.
Yeah.
So we actually are the innovators of vaccines, right? And sometimes you do need to introduce things to your body in the same way when you are a baby, you're introduced to solids, right? And you're introduced to different foods. And we know that one of the reasons why we have such a high incidence of allergic reactions is because exposure is limited in some cases, and so on.
Because once upon a time, people thought that they had to delay the introduction to reduce the risk. But now we have
like 12 months. They used to say,
But now there's all this research to tell us it's actually the opposite. So, and even that information hasn't reached all diverse communities. So there's even in that space, there's still.
I guess the other thing, I know from like my Arab background, I can tell you why there's some sort of conspiracy theories around vaccines and things like that, is because once the politicians get involved, it becomes a government thing. And so it's like, well, they're not going to be looking out for us. They're not going to be wanting the best for us. The government are there to sort of, take advantage of us and whatnot. So I guess with COVID, especially, it was one of the times the politicians were really vocal about taking the vaccine. And it's like, well, if they're talking about it, it's definitely not good.
Do you know what the really interesting thing is? Sorry to cut you off. One of the interesting things about that is that they're thinking through politicians through an Arabic lens, through a homeland lens.
Yes.
Right? When we apply contextual lensing and we apply Australian political lensing, right? In the Australian context, it is in the Australian government's best interest, right, to make sure that its population is healthy, because we have a universal healthcare system. If the population is not healthy, population becomes a burden on the state, right? And the government is also procuring the vaccines, paying for these vaccines so that the population can remain healthy and protected. And also, because at the early stages, the vaccines were very effective against disease and mortality, right? But then obviously with mutation and so on, it mutated away from that. And that happens. It's one of the things we were very clearly warning about from the very beginning, is that if you don't get vaccinated early enough, this thing will mutate. And it did. And it mutated away from our capabilities. But one of the reasons why they were pushing the vaccine so much was that because it was so effective against mortality. In other parts of the world, even in Australia, during our first wave of COVID, right, in 2020, our mortality rate, or crude mortality rate in 2020 was 3.2 or 3.7%, I believe it was. 3.2 or 3.7% of people who had COVID died, right? Imagine that COVID became so widespread as it did later on with a weaker strain, but with a more intense strain. Imagine 3.7% of 10 million people at the time. I think it was late 2021. That's how many people were infected. Imagine 10 million people had COVID. So 3.7% of 10 million people is a lot of dead people, right? That would cripple the workforce. That in essence would cripple the workforce and cripple an entire country.
Yeah. But like you mentioned, a lot of, I think, immigrants or, people who've come from overseas, they have that mentality, which is, it's an oppressive regime. They've come from an oppressive regime and they bring that sort of mentality here. And that's what I felt like I was facing, which is, the government's trying to, again, it's a dictatorship and it's that sort of, so I felt a lot of that rhetoric was sort of being, I understood that with a lot of hesitancy. With regards to the COVID and the vaccine. I think when people actually started to see it and members started to get sick, they're sort of like, oh, maybe I was wrong.
Yeah.
Maybe, it is really bad. And when their family started to get really sick, then they were like, oh, snap, it's really bad. We should take the vaccine. So
absolutely.
You started to see that turn around at that point.
And it was the same here as well in our community. I'm not sure if you're in Melbourne or if you're not. But
we're in Melbourne.
In Sydney, it was the same. And really funny enough, my favorite thing and my favorite discussion point actually was, have you seen COVID with your eyes? I'm like, yes, I have. You can see it through an electron microscope.
I think we all got
that. I can show you a photo. I can show you a photo if you'd like.
It's such a blur to me. Like, I know it was such a hard time for everyone, but I think because of that trauma, like, from everything, especially for us in Victoria. Like life was very different with like hard lockdown and things like that.
Yeah.
It's that whole time, that whole period of time is such a blur to me. Like I didn't even remember some of those conversations. I'm like, oh my God, like, we did. I'm like, oh yeah, we did have a curfew till like 9 p.m. for a while. Oh, I did. Remember that. But
my wife lived in North Melbourne, right near the towers that was locked down.
Yes.
Yeah, so she has fond memories of that.
I remember that.
Yeah. Fond is the right word for it. I guess on that same wavelength, like in terms of like, the government and big pharma, big vaccine, if you call it that. A lot of people think there's a lot of these financial incentives and there's, financial gain behind getting vaccinated and the government pushing all this stuff. And, are you able to summarize to our listeners how vaccine research is actually conducted and touch on this belief a little bit?
Okay, so the development of these vaccines were not just 1 year in the making, right? These vaccines have been under development since 2001. And I say 2001 mainly because COVID is related to SARS and is related to MERS, right? It's genomically 80% similar. The original variant is 80% similar to the first SARS outbreak in 2001, I believe it was 2003. Yeah. So since then, we've been working on vaccines and working on ways to prevent a pandemic from a coronavirus, right? Especially these kind of coronaviruses, the SARS. When MERS came along in 2014, I believe it was, it accelerated that research again because the research kept on going and coming and going in waves. And then when MERS broke out, it was another nudge that we need to get this done. We need to get this done quickly. And then MERS lost funding, as everything does, and as COVID has now, actually. But scientists kept on working on it in the background, kept on working on vaccine development and trying to get things to work for these coronaviruses, because they're not like normal viruses, right? They're incredibly unstable because they're RNA viruses, and they are likely to mutate very quickly, right? And the way they enter the cells and the way that they cause multi-system inflammation as well, and everything they do are very different to typical viruses. So the world has always been on warning, on alert and on warning for these kind of viruses, right? And then in when Trump was in power, he actively disabled this kind of pandemic research in the US, effectively crippling the world a little bit for such things. So, but other countries picked it up and started continuing working on the vaccines. And then when COVID hit, there was a rush of funding to vaccine development. But one thing we realized was that different institutions had different pieces of the puzzle. Right. One of the reasons why you had AstraZeneca and Oxford working together, and you had Pfizer and BioNTech working together, is because they each had different pieces of the puzzle. So they decided to work together to actually make sure that they connect the pieces to make things work. Right. So that's how the vaccines came around so quickly. After they weren't really there so quickly, there were years and years and years in the making. But then the pieces came together quickly in 2020. And then when the clinical trials were run, they ran them concurrently, right? So they ran phase 1 alongside phase 2, and phase 3 was towards the end. So they layered it on top of each other to make sure that they were quick, because it's a pandemic. You need to be able to get it out quick, right? To make sure that it was safe, it was effective, and it was replicable, and it did what it had to do, right? So that's how we were able to get the vaccine out so quickly. And then the distribution of the vaccine in 2001, so end of 2020, I think it was, in early 2021 onwards, was the distribution of the vaccine. And that's when the cold storage and everything else came as a problem, because we're trying to figure out how do we get something that requires, I think it was like minus 70 degrees storage to the other side of the planet to be able to vaccinate as many people. And when we look at how much that all costs, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars to actually get this study and to actually get the vaccine to where it needs to, and then get out the facilities to produce these things, right? So tens of billions of dollars, if not hundreds of billions of dollars, since the beginning of 2001 and onwards, so since the first SARS outbreak. So when COVID happened, the vaccines were starting to be released. AstraZeneca actually started releasing the vaccine at cost, right? So they actually made no money off their vaccine because all they needed was to pay back for their APIs, the active pharmaceutical ingredients, as well as their production costs and manufacturing costs. So they actually sold their vaccine for, I think it's like $3 a dose, right? Which is at cost. Pfizer sold at a massively reduced rate. I think it was like $11 or $12 a dose. So again, not massive amount of money, but when you're talking about the number of people being treated, it adds up, right? But there's still, when you look at, for example, with Pfizer, because they needed the minus 70 degrees cold storage and the production facility and everything for mRNA vaccines, these are new kinds of approaches to vaccinology. Their production facilities were costs were astronomical, so their production costs were going to be more expensive, right? So in essence, they weren't making this shit ton of money, excuse my language, compared to what people made it out as.
Compared to what people selling vaccine detoxes made on Instagram.
Exactly. Yeah.
Let's go there. Yeah.
Yeah, so when I looked at exactly, I think one person was selling a kit for like $250 or $300 or something like that. I'm like, and you're claiming these guys are profiteering? You're profiteering off the pandemic.
Yeah. It was such a hard time, I think, for us as health professionals, like being in that online space, but especially, as naturopaths in that natural health world, like, just seeing so many different health providers just sort of, profiting from people's fear and selling solutions, which,
unethical.
Unethical, no guarantee in anything. And in terms of just the marketing of it all and seeing it, it was really hard. And I think that's when my passion for myth busting kind of came about. It was actually during COVID, getting all these customers coming into the health food store that I used to manage saying, oh, I heard that pine needle tea is really good for the spike protein. And I'm like, but what does that even mean? Like, what does that actually mean? Like, is it going to like marry up with, is it going to like do a tango with the spike protein? Like, what does it actually mean? So,
do they know what the spike protein is?
Yeah, exactly. So, and I think, there was just so many bizarre kind of ideas and treatment strategies and methods. Like, people were just so desperate,
and people
obviously.
were afraid.
Yeah.
I think people were genuinely afraid. They didn't know. It was a scary time. People didn't know what tomorrow looked like. And, we're privileged to know what tomorrow will look like in Australia, and we're really afraid that, oh my God, we don't know what tomorrow is going to look like. And I think that just made a lot of people really insecure and really just grabbing for anything that they felt like they were familiar with. So
the funny thing with that is that they actually grabbed onto things that caused more fear. So even though it was a scary time, because when you look at it, really, right, all the people that were very much anti-vax, in terms of the prominent people, the prominent anti-COVID, anti-vax people, whether it be Malone or whatever the other people's are, all these people, all they actually did was add on fear.
Yeah.
Right? They added fear and uncertainty on top of uncertainty and fear. And people really latched onto that fear and uncertainty because it reinforced their fear and uncertainty.
Yeah.
Vaccines gave hope, right? The antivirals gave hope. But then people who started listening to these pundits became so anxious and so fearful of these pieces of hope that they didn't want them anymore.
Yeah.
They much rather try their hands with a virus who you don't know how your body's going to react to.
Yeah.
Right? So, for example, I'll give you 10 people and expose them to the same COVID variant. You're going to get 10 different reactions because every person's body is different. But with the vaccines, you know that the vast majority are going to be okay. You're going to get this, you're going to get that. If you're going to get a fever, you're going to get a bit of a headache, you're going to feel a bit tired. And then in some people, you may get a little bit of a increased heart rate, which will subside after a couple of weeks if that's the case. And then compared to if you were to get the virus, that increased heart rate is going to turn into severe myocarditis, which means you're going to be in hospital for 4 to 6 weeks instead. Right. So it's the way that they brought around this fear mongering, really. And that's what it was. Everything. And they accused us of being fear mongers because of COVID. But in reality, they fear mongered against the hope that we provided people. right? And that is arguably worse than telling people to be cautious of COVID.
Yeah, and they were just they were taking that as an opportunity as well to have their platform and to have their say and to, you know, what do you call it, monetize on it as well. So yeah, it wasn't great. It wasn't great. Not a great time.
I think there was a post that I made, and I'm trying to remember the number. It was by the Center to Counter Hate. They calculated how much money these people, the top five, I think it was, the top five pundits, anti-vax and anti-COVID pundits, made in 1 year. I think it was in the realm of like $7 or $8 million. They made purely profiteering off the backs of people during COVID by fear mongering.
It's so important to put it into numbers, I think, for our listeners so that they can understand like the depth of, you know, this discussion that we're having, and it just really puts it all into perspective.
Absolutely.
You know,
and also coming from a place of understanding, like we understand what their worries are and where they're coming from. And we have the similar worries, but we have more information than they do. We understand it better than they do. And so, yeah, we're trying to deliver it in that way that at least opens their eyes a little bit to see it's the other side of the coin.
Yeah,
absolutely.
As healthcare providers, you know, speaking of Miriam and myself, like what role do you think that healthcare professionals do play in addressing vaccine hesitancy, promoting vaccination with, you know, patients, clients, and how can we effectively communicate the importance of vaccines with our clients?
It's a very good question. And I think the most important thing is to just give time to your patients to actually have that conversation, right? So one of the problems we faced, and I'm talking we as in epidemiologists and other mythbusters and fact checkers and anti-vaxxers faced during COVID, was that medical professionals were so inundated with work that they didn't have time to have these conversations with their patients. And the patients were left just fending for themselves, searching for information online. So have time and make the time to speak to your patients about these and have an open conversation to really understand their worries and what is they're worried about and what they're afraid of when it comes to vaccinating their kids or vaccinating themselves against a certain disease. Help them understand the implications of the disease rather than the implications of possible outcomes and so on. And then if you have a conversation with them about side effects, because that always comes up, give them the numbers, right? Like you give them the numbers and the stats if you have them. Like, for example, extremes or severe side effects are 1 in a million in some cases, right? Or 1 in 500,000 in some cases, depending on which vaccine we're talking about.
And I've had that conversation with some mums, and they say, well, what if my child is the millionth? Then what?
Yeah. And but what if they're the 999,999?
And that conversation can be had for like literally any medical intervention, like something as basic as getting IV, you know, like morphine or antibiotics or like Panadol, like
Panadol kills, Panadol kills 20 people every year in Australia. Paracetamol kills 20 people every year in Australia.
Yeah, I was reading about paracetamol overdose not long ago.
Yeah.
It's actually one of the painful ways to die. Did you know that? I learned that in nursing school. People actually kill themselves by overdosing on Panadol. I was like, what? Yeah. Anyway.
It's horrible. It's absolutely horrible. Yeah. And it's, again, 20 people every year die in Australia from paracetamol overdosing.
Yeah. And
when we look at how many people have actually died from vaccines, the number you could probably count on one hand or two hands. And I'm talking about like over decades.
Yeah.
So when we look at extreme outcomes, there are things that we consider to be extremely safe that actually have worse outcomes and worse numbers, and things that we consider to be extremely dangerous, right? And even then, the chances are of a person dying in a car crash are actually higher, or like 3 to 5 times higher, if not considerably higher. I haven't got the actual numbers in front, but considerably higher than dying from a vaccine or developing some of these severe side effects. So you could compare it. Even better yet, you're more likely to be bitten by a shark or struck by lightning than you are to develop some of these side effects.
Yeah, but as well, it always comes back to the fear of the unknown. if you probably sat them down and actually talked them through the ingredients of the vaccine, they'll be like, oh, that's, people actually have no idea, or they think, there's a book where it's like the dirty ingredients of vaccines. Oh, it's got mercury, it's got this, it's got that. And so people hear that and immediately they freak out, not knowing how tiny the dosage is, how it's found in fruits and veggies, and it's like everywhere in the air. And so when it's fear, you know, and they just don't know. They just don't know.
And when people talk about aluminium, or they talk about other metals and other things, a person on average consumes a lot of aluminium from their food, right? And through their utensils and through their things that they consume. And your deodorant has more aluminium in it than a lot of things. And people don't pay attention to these things, right? And the amount of aluminium in vaccines is, in most cases, is none, right? So in a lot of cases, I actually don't know of vaccines that have aluminium in it. And
formaldehyde was the other one that people were afraid of, and they were saying, you know what they do for formaldehyde? They preserve dead bodies in it. And so when you put it like that, and then I read somewhere that there was more formaldehyde in a pear than there was in the vaccine.
Yeah, you know, if you eat enough seeds of apples, it could kill you.
Yeah. Even like the apricot seed kernels, a lot of people were going hard on those for a while, and they're like a source of cyanide as well.
Yeah.
So but
exactly.
People, you can put anything if you put it in the wrong context, you can put anything in a scary manner.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
If you're highlighting the bad ingredients in a vaccine and you're showing where the harm is in it, then of course people are going to be scared from it. But if you point out things where it's in things that are everyday items, you'll be like, oh, okay, well, I'm not.
And that's part of having the conversation. That's exactly it. So when you have that conversation with your patients and your clients, you're trying to understand what they're afraid of, right? And if they're afraid of the ingredients, then you have the time to sit down and walk them through the ingredients and actually point out that these ingredients are everywhere, right? And they're nothing to really, really be afraid of.
I love that. That's awesome. Yeah. Okay, tricky one. Should vaccines be mandated or not? What's your opinions on that issue? Are there any potential drawbacks, benefits in mandating vaccine?
So as healthcare professionals, vaccines are already mandated. You can't work in New South Wales Health, and you can't work in many state health facilities without being vaccinated for certain things, right? As myself, I've got a little yellow book from the WHO. I can't travel to certain countries without that book. And that book has all my vaccines in it. You can't fly into Saudi to go to Umrah or to Hajj without your yellow fever vaccine, or no, meningitis vaccine, I think it is. And from certain places, you can't fly in without your yellow fever vaccine. So they are already mandated, and they're mandated for certain reasons, right? Because some of these diseases are extremely debilitating and entirely preventable. So if we could prevent something and ensure that we protect not only the children, but also the people around the children, then of course I support it. An interesting thing about why we mandate vaccines and why we want this kind of widespread coverage of vaccine is partly herd immunity, right? We heard a lot about herd immunity, but in the wrong context during COVID, right? Herd immunity is when you have enough people in a population inoculated against a pathogen, so whether it be a virus or bacteria or something, so that when it does enter the population, it does not spread as fast anymore, and it doesn't spread as wide anymore. And the reason why we put targets on or put a cap or a number of how many people should be inoculated is because there are different models that indicate that if a virus has an R naught of 5, right, it means one person can infect 5 people readily per sitting. It means that if you interrupt that spread by, say, inoculating 4 of those 5, then that's potentially a whole lot less people being inoculated, being infected, right? When it comes to measles and it comes to other infections, right, the reason why we vaccinate children is because, and the reason why we try to make it mandatory and we try to make sure that everyone is vaccinated is because, firstly, children are less likely to say, oh, something is wrong with me, until you notice it and it's too late. And then they've infected a whole lot of people, right? And they've also probably developing worse outcomes because it's much more progressed in them. And the second thing is, when you inoculate everyone for something, there are certain people in the population that cannot have a vaccine, right? So if you're some people who are severely immunocompromised or immunosuppressed, right? For example, certain people, so some HIV people can't take certain vaccinations because if they're active attenuated or so on, then it risks them getting sick.
Yeah.
So some people, and there are children or people who are allergic to ingredients in the vaccine. And we saw that with some of the vaccines that we had for COVID. Some people who were exempt from being vaccinated were people who were allergic to ingredients in the vaccines, right? So when you vaccinate other people, these people, the small number of people or population who can't get vaccinated, are also protected because the people around them are protected from getting sick.
Yeah.
So there's a huge reduction in risk of transmission because the people around them are not likely to get sick because they're inoculated. So that's herd immunity.
Awesome. I'm glad you clarified that. That was a really good.
That was a wonderful breakdown.
It's good that you mentioned that. Yeah.
The COVID-19 pandemic. So this is relative to some of the things that we actually already spoke about, but we saw during the pandemic that there was disparities in healthcare access and outcomes. Is there any strategies, do you think, that can improve vaccine distribution and access to ensure that everyone has the opportunity to get vaccinated?
No, I think everyone already has the opportunity to get vaccinated. It's the messaging around vaccinations and the need to get vaccinated that is lacking, right? People still don't understand why they should get vaccinated and I hear it every single day. Oh, it's just a flu. Oh, it's nothing. It's become weak. I just get sick for a day and then there's nothing wrong. I'm like, well, look, you may feel that now, but give it a 6 weeks and you may not be able to get out of bed because your body feels so heavy and you're so fatigued, right? So you don't know what the impact of this virus is going to be on your body long term, right? You don't know what the inflammation in your system is going to do to you. So it's much better to just be vaccinated with, whether it be the COVID vaccines, whether it be the flu vaccine, whether it be measles or your meningitis or your pneumococcal or any number of vaccines that you could get. It's better to be vaccinated against them. And even if you do get infected with the less effective vaccines, you get a less intense infection than to be unvaccinated and risk the severe outcomes that come with that. Because even our studies show that for those people who are vaccinated and do get sick, whether it be with cholera or whether it be with COVID, have better outcomes than people who are unvaccinated and got cholera or COVID.
Yeah. So before we wrap it up, what do you say to the people who say, well, getting it naturally is better and vaccines weaken your immune system?
They don't weaken your immune system. The entire notion of them weakening your immune system is what do you call it? It's counterintuitive because vaccines use your immune system to develop immunity, right? It'll be counterintuitive for them to destroy your immune system for you to develop immunity against one thing. They, in fact, strengthen your immune system by helping your immune system develop itself and build itself up against a pathogen that's entered your body. So, in fact, it's doing the opposite. It's strengthening your immune system, not weakening. In fact, it's the infection that weakens your immune system because it causes a widespread inflammation in your body and attacks your body in ways that we are still quantifying. We're still actually figuring out how this virus is attacking our body. And we're 3.5 years in.
I definitely see that myself. Maybe you do as well, Miriam, in clinical practice, in terms of like people coming to see me that had COVID maybe 6 months ago, 1 year ago, 2 years ago, and they haven't felt well since. They've got, chronic fatigue since, or gut symptoms. And often when they're coming with all these different symptoms and pathologies, we're looking at their timeline, we find out that they've had COVID or they've had influenza and they've never been well since that time. So you raise a really good point there in terms of there are a lot of long-term concerns around how it is affecting their immune system long-term and what it's actually doing to their health over time, especially with COVID. And I think we're going to have really interesting research maybe over the next 5 to 10 years that will come out, similar to what we saw with Epstein-Barr virus and MS. All these years later, boom, there's like a correlation.
Absolutely.
So
And just one thing before I forget as well, one of the reasons why, again, you can't really rely on this argument that infection is always better is that we had infection was always better for thousands of years up until we had antibiotics and vaccinations, right? Our life expectancy was between 40 to 60 to 40 to 45 and 50 in some cases, right? Life expectancy increased when we started developing medications and vaccines. So if you want to rely on natural is always best and your immune system can do what God created, and yes, you can do what God created to, but sometimes it will fail. And when it fails, you die, right? Or you develop a severe disability. So there's a reason why we have people living longer. It's because we have medications that enable a person to do that, including vaccinations. And that's by supporting and improving your immune system, not by weakening your immune system.
Yeah. So if you want that mentality, then I guess you've got to accept the consequences that come with it, I guess.
Absolutely, yeah. So, thank you so much for your time.
I really appreciate it. Hopefully we get to like part 2 maybe, because like there's so much more.
Always welcome.
Before we wrap up, where can our listeners find you? So I know you're not active at the moment because you're living your best life and working and married and all the things. But you know, if they wanted to check out your content, like is your Instagram where you're mainly present online? So
I've got my Instagram and I've got my Facebook page. They're both the same handle, at Dr. Mo Assoum.
Amazing.
Beautiful. Any final messages?
Yeah, any final remarks you'd like to throw out there?
Little gems that you want people to
little gems. To actually have conversations with people and don't rely on people who are actually profiteering off fear, which are these fear-mongering pundits and people who are trying to distract away from the real problems really in life.
We really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Go get some much needed rest, and inshallah we can do maybe a part 2.
Inshallah, sounds good. Thank you very much.
Have a good night.
Have an amazing evening. Thank you so much.
You too. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Take care.